Hello everyone, welcome to session 3 of LTEC 651 Interactive Multimedia Production. In today's video, we're going to cover 4 topics. First, I want to tackle briefly a possible misconception that I saw in some of your reflection posts recently. Then, I want to explore different graphic types and image-text relationships. From there, we'll roll up our sleeves and examine some of the more technical aspects of creating multimedia. And finally, we'll end by previewing the wide range of multimedia authoring tools that exist today. So let's get started. I want to begin with a possible misconception regarding Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This is something I noticed while grading the first critical reflection, which involved analyzing Wesch's video, "The Machine is Using Us." Recall that the active learning assumption states that humans engage in active learning by doing 3 things. First, selecting relevant incoming information, organizing that information into a coherent mental model, and then integrating that information with existing knowledge. The misconception has to do with who is doing what in relation to the active learning assumption. In other words, who is doing the selecting, organizing, and integrating? Is it the producer of the multimedia or the consumer of the multimedia? Some of you suggested that Wesch, the producer of "The Machine is Using Us" video, was the one who selected, organized, and integrated media. While this is probably true, it was not the connection I was expecting you to make. Instead, I was hoping you would emphasize the consumer of Wesch's video. In other words, the learner. After all, Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning is focused on learners and how they consume, and ideally make sense of, multimedia presentations. In short, Mayer's theory is not about what Wesch did as the producer of a video, although Mayer would certainly want Wesch and other creators of multimedia to know how to build multimedia presentations that align with human cognitive processing. I hope this distinction makes sense, and if it's not clear, please reach out to me. Okay, enough about that. Let's move on. Now I'd like to explore what we learned in Clark and Mayer's article about applying the multimedia principle. In this article, we learned that providing relevant graphics with text is a proven method of fostering deeper cognitive processing in learners. In addition, we learned that not all graphics are equally effective. We also learned that students may misjudge the value of illustrations. And it turns out that students actually have difficulty distinguishing illustrations that help them learn from those that do not help them learn. This reality means that designers should only use highly relevant instructional illustrations. It also means designers should point out in the text what to look for in illustrations. Now, one of the important takeaways from research on the multimedia principle is recognizing that graphics can serve different purposes in multimedia. Fortunately, Clark and Mayer provide us with an excellent breakdown of 6 graphic types and how they do or do not add value to the learning process. The first graphic type is decorative. These are visuals added for aesthetic appeal or for humor. An example is a person riding a bike in a lesson about how a bicycle pump works. The picture is topically relevant, but has nothing to do with how a bike pump actually works. The second graphic type is representational, and these are visuals that illustrate the appearance of an object, such as a photo of equipment. The third graphic type is organizational, and these are visuals that show qualitative relationships among content, such as a tree diagram. The fourth graphic type is relational, and these are visuals that summarize quantitative relationships. An example of a relational graphic would be a weather map with colors being used to represent different temperatures. A fifth graphic type is transformational, and these are visuals that illustrate changes in time or over space. The example Clark and Mayer provide is a time-lapse animation of seed germination. The sixth and final type of graphic is interpretive, and these are visuals that make intangible phenomena visible and concrete. An example of an interpretive graphic might be a picture that shows how data is transmitted through the internet, something we can't really see. Okay, so now that we know about these 6 graphic types, let's analyze the using computer ports example. What kind of graphics were used in this multimedia instructional message? Well, I would say the images of the ports and the cables are representational graphics. They are there to illustrate the appearance of real-world objects. In this case, the computer ports and their corresponding cables. Also, while I have this screenshot up, I want to point out the excellent use of signaling in this example. By signaling, I mean the orange outline surrounding the HDMI port, which signals to the learner that this port is used for a cable that looks like the one shown on the left. This is an example of a design decision that promotes generative processing. After all, learners need to know what to pay attention to and how to integrate information to construct their own mental models. Accordingly, the signaling principle recommends that instructors add cues, such as these orange lines, that direct learners' attention to salient material. All right, let's move on. So you might be wondering, is there any evidence that graphic type actually matters when it comes to learner comprehension? Well, the short answer is yes. This is an evidence-based phenomenon that has been thoroughly researched. For example, let's take a look at this 2014 study by Yeager and Wiley. Essentially, they wanted to know, how do illustrations impact readers' meta-comprehension? Now, they define meta-comprehension as the ability to predict how well one will do on comprehension tests after reading a text. So, to answer that question, they created a multimedia presentation about volcanoes and included different illustrations, which they labeled as either decorative or conceptual. Now, using those materials, they asked undergraduate students to read non-illustrated texts or read the same text illustrated with either the conceptual or the decorative images. And after the students read the text, they judged how well they understood the text, and finally, they took tests on each topic. So if you look down here at the bottom, you can see the image on the left shows the decorative image of a volcano. The one in the middle shows the conceptual image of a volcano. And then the image on the right shows you the text in the image combined, just so you know what the students were actually experiencing. So what were the results? Well, it turns out that the decorative images led to poorer meta-comprehension accuracy on the part of the undergraduates. And the authors concluded that seductive information, in other words, the decorative images, may have actually undermined comprehension monitoring in these undergraduate students. So there's a concrete example of how graphic type matters in a multimedia context. While we're talking about the multimedia principle, I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of text-image relationships. In other words, what are the different ways text and image can be related? Well, believe it or not, there's an entire area of research addressing this very question. For example, here's a tree diagram outlining the equality of text and image. Before I got into multimedia learning, these are things I never thought about before. And here's another attempt to create a taxonomy of text-image relationships. In fact, these researchers identified over 40 different possibilities, which they outlined here in this table. Now, that's a little too detailed for our purposes, so let me share another interesting analysis of text and image relationships from Lewis's 2012 book titled Reading Contemporary Picture Books. In this book, Lewis argues there is a range of text-image relationships that go from symmetrical on the one hand all the way to contradictory on the other. Let's take a look at some specific examples. So one possible relationship between text and image is one that is symmetrical. And according to Lewis, a text-image relationship is symmetrical when the text and image come as close as possible to conveying the same information or telling the same story. Now, another possible relationship is one of enhancement. And a text-image relationship is an enhancement when one element, either the image or the text, significantly changes the meaning of the other. A third possible relationship is that of a counterpoint. A text-image relationship is a counterpoint when images and text provide different kinds of information that the reader must make some effort to reconcile and integrate. This, of course, is closely related to the active processing assumption, the idea that learners have to select, organize, and integrate information. The fourth possible relationship is one of contradiction. A text-image relationship is deemed a contradiction when images and text seem to be saying entirely different things. So what do these four possible text-image relationships tell us about the using computer ports example? Well, in this example, we're seeing text-image relationships that provide enhancement. For example, because of the image at the top, we see the letters HDMI printed above one port of the computer, and we see additional text that helps us understand that those letters actually mean something. HDMI stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface. This is an example of an enhancement. While we're out of time for this section, I'd ask you to reflect on the designs you created for Design Project 1. The assignment deliberately required you to include an image or avatar of yourself, as well as two pieces of text, your name and a quote of your liking. What are the kinds of text-image relationships in your design? This is just something to think about as we move on. In this section, I'd like to talk about the skills, materials, and tools of multimedia authoring, or, as it is stated in the title of the course, multimedia production. Importantly, we must realize that multimedia production is very much an interdisciplinary endeavor. It involves several skill sets to varying degrees. For example, multimedia production almost certainly involves instructional design skills. Instructional design, of course, is the practice of systematically designing, developing, and delivering instructional products and experiences. The goal of instructional design is to create instruction that is efficient, effective, and meaningful. Now, in addition to instructional design skills, more and more these days, multimedia production involves web design skills. And of course, web design is the practice of creating presentations of content that are delivered online. The goal of web design is to use appearance, layout, and content to create a design that is easy to use, aesthetically pleasing, and suits the user group and the brand. Of course, today's multimedia projects also have interfaces. Thus, user interface design skills are very relevant. Interface design is the practice of making interfaces in software with a focus on looks or style. Its goal is to create designs that users find easy to use and pleasurable. Arguably, the fourth skill area has to do with interactivity because today's multimedia is not static. Thus, we may want to draw on interaction design skills. So what is interaction design? Well, interaction design is the practice of making interactive digital products and services. Its goal is to provide the best way for people to solve a task or reach a particular goal. It emphasizes behavior. Now, all of these skills overlap to some degree, and you don't necessarily need to be an expert in all of them. But it is important to recognize the interdisciplinary nature of this kind of work. And at a minimum, I would argue that you should have enough knowledge of each of these areas to be conversant with clients and/or collaborators working on a multimedia product. If those are some of the skills needed to create multimedia instructional messages, what are some of the tools and materials? Well, to answer that question, we need to learn more about the language of user interfaces. After all, these days, most multimedia is something users see and interact with digitally. Therefore, it is ultimately software and has an interface. So what are the building blocks of user interfaces? There's no definitive list, but you could think of these building blocks as interface elements, components, or widgets. And each of these elements facilitates a specific type of interaction, either behavioral or cognitive. And these interactions take place between the learner and the multimedia instructional message. And generally speaking, we can divide these elements into two categories. The first category contains content elements. These are all of the media that we know make up multimedia. The second category contains control elements. And these are all of the controls we use to control software. Examples include input controls such as checkboxes, radio buttons, and drop-downs. Other examples include navigational controls such as breadcrumbs, sliders, and search fields. There's also informational controls such as tooltips, progress bars, and notifications. Taken together, these are some of the main building blocks that we're going to be using to create rich multimedia experiences. So let's apply these building blocks to the using computer ports example by asking ourselves what interface elements were required to create this multimedia instructional message. On one level, this example is nothing more than text and pictures. However, on another level, it is so much more than that. It is actually a carefully designed interactive multimedia experience. So what interface elements are needed to create this experience from the ground up? Well, there's text and images, there's hotspots and a timer, there's a button, there's text input field, that's how the application knows our name. There's a drag and drop interaction to allow us to move the cables to the proper ports, and there's even a progress bar and a percent gauge to help us track our progress. That's quite a few interface elements just to build this simple interactive multimedia presentation. So what's needed to actually build something like this? Well, we've talked about the skills and we've talked about the materials, but what about the tools? Well, as you could probably imagine, we need some sort of authoring environment to put everything together. An authoring environment or tool is simply software for creating and arranging content into standardized structures that can be exported and shared in different ways. Now on this screen, we're seeing a sampling of some of the e-learning software suites that currently exist. And as you can see, there's lots of them. This is a very crowded and fast-moving sector. And each of these companies is trying to gain market share and differentiate itself. They all offer different combinations of tools and services. Some of them web-based, some of them not, some of them cross-platform, some of them not. But they're all trying to solve common challenges involved in producing multimedia. Examples of these common challenges include how do we create high-quality multimedia but do it quickly? Another challenge is how do we ensure original creative multimedia while supporting standardized formats and delivery mechanisms? And a third common challenge is how do we create effective multimedia if we don't have a huge team of designers and developers to support us? So let's take a closer look at some of these examples. Of course, we have Adobe Captivate, and Adobe describes Adobe Captivate as a smart authoring tool that lets you create all kinds of fully responsive content. Another example is Gomo Learning, which they described as a cloud-based, mobile-first, responsive HTML5 e-learning authoring tool. Growth Engineering is a bit different. They have a tool called Genie, which they say is a game-based content authoring tool. It allows users to build full-fledged game-based learning experiences that supercharge engagement levels and encourage repeat plays and drive real behavior change. Now here's a more detailed look at one of the main players in this space, which is Articulate's Storyline 360. And you can read a little bit here about this software package. They're really trying to help people by bringing everything together in the sense that it provides authoring tools, it provides digital assets such as images and videos. There's even live training. I want to point out the cost of this, which is quite high. The education pricing for Storyline 360 is $500 a year. Okay, so we've looked at quite a few examples. Now I want to end by previewing the kinds of multimedia content that can be built with these skills, materials, and tools. Ultimately, all of these things are designed to create reusable interactive content, such as interactive videos, quizzes, and simulations and games. And starting this week, we'll begin authoring our own examples of multimedia instructional messages. And with that, we'll wrap things up. Have a great week, everyone, and I'll see you in Canvas.